A racist cop punches Mike Tyson, thinking he holds all the power, until Tyson reminds him, in the most brutal way, who truly does. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. The scorching sun hung low over the city of Chicago, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. The aroma of sizzling street food mingled with the acrid scent of car exhaust, creating a potent mix of urban life. Laughter and conversation filled the air, blending into the distant wail of sirens, an ever-present soundtrack to the city. In the midst of the chaotic symphony, Mike Tyson walked with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced life's hardest punches and still stood tall. His muscular frame moved effortlessly through the crowd, each step a deliberate stride of a man who had nothing to prove, but everything to protect. Dressed in a black-fitted t-shirt and jeans, he was an unshakable force of nature, a legend carved in flesh and bone. Despite his calm demeanor, whispers followed him like a ripple through water. A few onlookers recognized him instantly, their murmurs of awe barely audible over the city's noise. Some snapped covert photos, others simply watched in silent admiration. But among the many sets of eyes on him that afternoon, one pair burned with something far more sinister. A few feet away, leaning against his patrol car, Officer Darren Holt adjusted his sunglasses and scowled. A man built like a tank, with a grizzled beard and a permanent sneer, Holt had patrolled these streets for over a decade. But his brand of law enforcement wasn't about protection. It was about power. The badge on his chest had become a tool of oppression rather than justice, a weapon he wielded with merciless precision. And today, he found himself fixated on a target that irritated him more than most. His fingers tapped against his belt, where his baton hung menacingly. He wasn't just watching Mike Tyson, he was hunting him. To him, Tyson was an anomaly, a man who didn't fit into the neat, controlled boxes of his worldview, a powerful black man who carried himself with unwavering pride. That alone made him a problem. A cruel smirk twisted across Holt's lips. "Look at him," he muttered under his breath, "walking around here like he owns the place." His partner, Officer Rick Sanders, younger but equally corrupt, let out a chuckle. "That's Mike Tyson, man. You really want to mess with him?" Holt spat onto the pavement, his eyes never leaving Tyson. "I don't care who he is. Guys like him think they're untouchable. Time someone reminded him who's really in charge." He straightened up and stepped forward, his presence radiating menace. "Hey, you," he barked, his voice slicing through the hum of city life like a whip. Tyson, in the middle of checking his phone, glanced up. His dark eyes locked onto the approaching officer with an expression that was neither aggressive nor fearful, just calculating. The surrounding crowd instinctively slowed, sensing the tension thickening in the air. Holt strode closer, his hand already resting on his baton. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his tone laced with condescension. "This isn't your kind of neighborhood." Tyson exhaled slowly, pocketing his phone. He had encountered men like Holt before, bullies in uniform, who mistook authority for dominance. "I'm walking," he replied, his deep voice calm but firm. "Is that a crime now?" Holt's jaw clenched at the response. He hated defiance, especially from people he considered beneath him. "We don't need troublemakers around here." His voice dripped with thinly veiled hostility. "So why don't you turn around and take that walk somewhere else?" A few bystanders murmured in disapproval, their gazes darting between the two men. They knew Tyson wasn't a man who backed down, but they also knew Holt had a reputation for making people disappear into a legal abyss of false charges and brutality. Tyson cocked his head slightly, his patience wearing thin. You got a reason to stop me, officer? Or are we just making up laws as we go? Holt's face reddened. He wasn't used to being questioned. He was used to being feared. He took another step forward, now standing inches from Tyson. You think just because you used to be someone, you can talk to me like that? He sneered. You're nobody out here, just another guy who needs to learn his place. Sanders shifted uneasily beside Holt. Even he could feel the ground shaking beneath them, the atmosphere charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Tyson, never one to be provoked easily, took a deep breath. But his fingers curled slightly at his sides, his body naturally adjusting to the possibility of a fight. The crowd, now fully aware of the altercation unfolding before them, grew silent. Camera phones emerged, capturing the moment in case things turned ugly. Holt, blind with arrogance, took the bait. He smirked, then without warning, shoved Tyson back, hard. The force barely made Tyson budge, but it was the intent that registered. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Holt wasn't done. He reached for his baton, raising it slightly as if considering his next move. Let's see how tough you really are, he muttered, his knuckles whitening around the grip. For a split second, Tyson considered walking away. But then he thought of all the times men like Holt had done this to others who couldn't fight back. He thought of the innocent people who had been crushed under the weight of this abuse, their voices drowned out by sirens and falsified reports. And in that moment, he made his decision. The legend of Mike Tyson was about to remind the world why some men should never be underestimated. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. Tyson's head barely moved from the impact, his expression unreadable as the street fell into absolute silence. The crowd, frozen in a mixture of horror and anticipation, held their breath. It was as if time itself hesitated, unsure of what would come next. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone, except for Officer Holt, whose smug expression remained plastered across his face, his hands flexing as if daring Tyson to react. Tyson exhaled slowly, his massive chest rising and falling, his knuckles twitching ever so slightly. He tasted the metallic sting of his own blood from the small cut inside his cheek. But he didn't raise his fists. Not yet. He had spent years mastering his rage, controlling the hurricane that once ruled him in the ring. Instead, he wiped the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes locking onto Holt's with a terrifying intensity. That's your move? Tyson's voice was quiet, yet it carried an unmistakable weight that sent chills through the bystanders. You think you can just hit me, and I'll back down? Holt scoffed, his fingers twitching toward his baton, emboldened by Tyson's momentary restraint. I don't care who you think you are, he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. I don't care how many fights you've won. Out here, I make the rules. You do what I say. He took a step closer, pressing his baton against Tyson's chest. And I say you don't belong here. The crowd stirred, murmurs growing louder as outrage bubbled beneath the surface. The tension was suffocating, a pressure cooker ready to explode. People raised their phones, recording the moment, knowing they were witnessing something that could not, should not, be ignored. One voice cut through the rising noise. This ain't right, a young man shouted from the back. We see you, officer. We see everything. Holt ignored the crowd, focusing solely on Tyson, convinced he had the upper hand. But something in Tyson's demeanor shifted. His muscles, which had been tight with restraint, loosened. His stance, which had been firm yet passive, shifted subtly, a fighter's instinct kicking in. Holt was too arrogant to recognize the change. Tyson's voice was dangerously low. I've been hit harder by amateurs. Holt's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. Instead, he swung his baton, aiming straight for Tyson's ribs. A fatal mistake. With lightning-fast reflexes, Tyson's hand shot out, catching the baton mid-swing. The force of the block sent a shockwave up Holt's arm, his fingers involuntarily loosening. In the blink of an eye, Tyson twisted the baton from the officer's grip and flung it to the pavement, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel, delivering a final verdict. Holt stumbled back, momentarily stunned. He reached for his taser, but Tyson was already moving. He closed the distance between them with terrifying speed, his presence engulfing Holt like a shadow of impending doom. "I tried to walk away," Tyson growled, his voice a mix of restraint and righteous fury. "But you wanted to test me." Holt barely had time to register what was happening before Tyson's fist, a legendary weapon honed over decades, drove into his gut with the force of a freight train. The impact sent Holt sprawling backward, his breath escaping in a choked gasp as he collapsed onto the pavement. The crowd erupted. Some cheered, others gasped, but all of them understood one undeniable truth. Justice had just been served in its purest form. Holt, wheezing, struggled to his feet, his face flushed with humiliation and fury. He staggered, reaching for his radio. "Backup," he rasped. "I need backup." "Backup?" Tyson scoffed, stepping closer, his voice dripping with disdain. "For what? You thought you were a big man when you hit me first. Now you need help?" The irony of the situation wasn't lost on the crowd. More voices joined in, condemning Holt's actions, demanding accountability. "You're on camera," someone shouted. "We saw everything." Before Holt could answer, the wail of sirens filled the air. A squad car skidded to a stop, doors flying open as officers rushed toward the scene. Their eyes darted between Holt, doubled over in pain, and Tyson, standing tall, unshaken. A senior officer stepped forward, eyes narrowing as he took in the situation. "What the hell is going on here?" The crowd surged forward, voices overlapping. "That cop started it. He hit Tyson first. It's all on camera." The officer's expression darkened as he turned to Holt. "Is that true?" Holt, still trying to catch his breath, wiped the sweat from his brow, his face pale. "He attacked me," he lied, his voice weak. "He resisted." "You're a liar." A woman stepped forward, holding up her phone. "I got it all right here. You hit him first, then tried to beat him down with your baton." The senior officer's gaze flickered to the phone's screen. His jaw tightened. The tension was thick, but there was no room for denial. He exhaled sharply before turning to Holt. "Hand over your badge." The silence that followed was deafening. Holt's eyes widened. "What?" "You're done." The officer's voice was cold, final. "You've disgraced this badge. You're suspended pending investigation." The crowd erupted in cheers as Holt, his world crumbling, stood frozen in disbelief. With shaking hands, he unfastened his badge, placing it in the officer's palm. The once mighty figure who had bullied so many now stood small, exposed before the people he had terrorized for years. Tyson, watching silently, finally spoke. "Power's only worth something if you use it right," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "You forgot that." As the officers led Holt away, the people gathered around Tyson, some shaking his hand, others thanking him. But Tyson didn't bask in the moment. He simply nodded, turned on his heel, and walked away, disappearing into the city, leaving behind a lesson that no one would ever forget. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. Tyson's head snapped to one side from the force of Officer Holt's punch, but his body barely moved. The street, alive with gasps and shocked murmurs, seemed to freeze in time as all eyes locked onto the moment. Slowly, deliberately, like a predator sizing up its prey, Tyson turned his head back, his dark eyes narrowing into cold, unrelenting fury. His jaw clenched, his fists flexing by his sides, veins protruding in his forearms like steel cables stretched to their limit. The man before Holt was not just a former champion. He was a force of nature, a living legend who had endured and conquered storms far greater than one corrupt cop. Holt, his arrogance faltering for a fleeting second, forced a smug grin, masking the sudden unease creeping up his spine. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" His voice lacked its previous confidence, a thin veil covering his own hesitation. The weight of the crowd's gaze bore down on him, their phones raised, capturing every second. But Holt was too far gone to retreat now. Tyson inhaled deeply, his massive chest rising as if he were preparing for the final bell in a championship bout. The air seemed to crackle with electricity, and in a flash, Tyson struck. His right fist shot forward, a blur of pure muscle and precision, colliding with Holt's gut like a sledgehammer to a tin wall. The officer's smug expression shattered into pure agony as he doubled over, his breath stolen in an instant. A strangled gasp escaped his lips, his body convulsing as he stumbled back, eyes bulging in shock. The impact sent him reeling, nearly collapsing under the weight of the unexpected onslaught. Tyson, methodical and unrelenting, did not let up. He stepped in, closing the distance like a lion stalking its wounded prey. His left hook came next, a devastating arc of raw power that crashed into Holt's ribs with a sickening crack. The sound echoed off the surrounding buildings, followed immediately by the crowd's eruption of cheers and exclamations. People hollered, fists raised, their collective energy fueling the fire of long-overdue justice. Holt staggered, his face contorted in shock and pain. His knees wobbled, his once overconfident demeanor crumbling into desperation. He reached for his baton, his fingers fumbling clumsily at his belt, but before he could grasp it, Tyson moved again. In one swift, effortless motion, Tyson's iron grip closed around the officer's wrist. Holt barely had time to yelp before Tyson twisted, forcing the baton from his grasp and sending it clattering onto the pavement with a hollow metallic clang. "You like using this to bully people?" Tyson's voice was low, dangerously calm, laced with a venomous disdain that sent shivers through the onlookers. "Let's see how tough you are without it." Holt's panicked eyes darted around, seeking an escape, but the crowd had swelled, forming an impenetrable ring around them. His bravado disintegrated as Tyson seized the front of his uniform with one colossal hand, effortlessly lifting him off his feet. The officer flailed, his arms scrambling against Tyson's unyielding grip, his polished boots dangling inches above the ground. "Put me down, you brute!" Holt shrieked, his voice a far cry from the commanding tone he had wielded just moments ago. The desperate tremor in his words betrayed the terror creeping into his core. Tyson smirked, cocking his head slightly. "You sure?" His words dripped with amusement, his voice a deadly whisper that carried through the silent, awestruck crowd. Then, with a controlled thrust, Tyson released his grip, sending Holt flying backward. The officer crashed against the curb, his body slamming onto the cold concrete with a force that rattled his bones. A pained groan escaped his lips as he lay sprawled out, his badge askew, his dignity shattered beyond repair. The street erupted. Cheers, applause, and celebratory shouts filled the air, an outpouring of triumph from the spectators who had long suffered under men like Holt. People clapped each other on the back, their joy unfiltered, their voices rising like a victorious chant in the heart of the city. Holt, gasping, wheezing, tried to crawl away, but the weight of his own disgrace held him down. He clutched his ribs, his face twisting in agony and disbelief. You're done, Tyson," he wheezed, his words lacking conviction. "You just assaulted an officer." Tyson rolled his shoulders back, stepping toward the fallen officer, his presence as imposing as ever. "Nah," he said, shaking his head with a knowing smirk. "I just defended myself, and the whole world saw it." He gestured toward the sea of smartphones capturing every angle of the encounter. Holt's blood ran cold as realization set in. The videos, the witnesses, the undeniable proof of his own wrongdoing, his career, his power, everything he had built on intimidation and lies, was crumbling before his eyes. As the wail of approaching sirens echoed through the street, Holt's face drained of color. The tide had turned. The system he had manipulated for so long was about to turn on him. And as the officers arrived, pushing through the crowd, their eyes assessing the scene with grim understanding, it was clear. Holt was no longer the one in control. Justice had arrived, and it came in the form of Mike Tyson. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. As Tyson stood tall, unshaken in the center of the chaos, the sharp wail of sirens pierced through the air, silencing the crowd's celebratory roar. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the glossy storefront windows, casting an ominous glow over the scene. Several patrol cars screeched to a halt, doors flying open as officers spilled onto the pavement, their hands instinctively resting on their holsters, their eyes darting between the fallen officer Holt and the imposing figure of Mike Tyson. The senior officer, Captain Reynolds, stepped forward, his lined face betraying a mixture of disbelief and calculated authority. He wasn't just any officer. He was a man who knew how to control a situation before it spiraled. His piercing gaze landed on Holt, who lay groaning on the ground, his badge barely clinging to his chest, his face a portrait of shame and defeat. "What the hell happened here?" Reynolds demanded, his voice slicing through the tense silence. Before Tyson could respond, the crowd erupted. "That cop attacked him first," a woman yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Holt. "We saw everything." "Yeah, he threw the first punch. Mike was just defending himself," another man bellowed, fists clenched in fury. Captain Reynolds held up a hand, silencing the crowd momentarily. He turned back to Tyson, eyeing him with a mix of caution and familiarity. "Mr. Tyson," he began, his tone unreadable. "Is this true?" Tyson, his stance unwavering, locked eyes with Reynolds. His voice was deep, measured, but carried the weight of a storm brewing beneath. "Your officer here," he gestured to the crumpled figure of Holt, "thought he could use his badge to intimidate me. He threw the first punch. I finished it." Reynolds's gaze flickered to the dozens of cell phones aimed at him, capturing every second. His reputation, his badge, everything hung in the balance. The crowd, now fully invested in the unfolding drama, watched with bated breath. Reynolds took a long, deep breath before turning his attention back to Holt. "Is this true?" he asked, his tone cold. Holt, still gasping for breath, wiped a trickle of blood from the corner of his mouth and sputtered. He resisted." He was being aggressive. "That's a damn lie." A bystander cut in, stepping forward. "We got it all on video. He was harassing Mike for no reason." Reynolds exhaled sharply. The evidence was overwhelming, the weight of public scrutiny too heavy to ignore. He turned back to Holt, his voice now void of patience. "You've been a problem for years, Holt, always walking that fine line. Today, you crossed it." He shook his head. You're done. Holt's face drained of color. Wait, what? Reynolds's jaw tightened. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending an internal investigation. Hand over your badge. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as Holt's jaw trembled. His hands, once steady with unchecked authority, fumbled with the clasp on his badge. The weight of his downfall pressed down on him, suffocating, inescapable. With a reluctant, shaking grip, he unclipped the badge from his chest and placed it into Reynolds' waiting palm. The crowd erupted into applause, cheers and jeers alike filling the night air. The people, tired of abuse, tired of injustice, had witnessed something rare, a corrupt officer facing immediate consequences. Holt turned to Tyson, his eyes filled with bitter resentment. You think this makes you a hero? He spat. Tyson took a slow step forward, towering over the disgraced officer. His voice, though quiet, carried the force of a hurricane. No, he said, his tone like steel. A hero doesn't fight for himself. He fights for others. And you? You abused your power. You thought you could get away with it. Tyson let the words hang in the air before leaning in slightly, his final words a low, ominous whisper. You learned today that real power isn't in a badge. It's in respect. And you lost that. Holt swallowed hard, his bravado completely shattered. He turned away, shuffling towards the waiting squad car as the crowd taunted him. The very people he once lorded his authority over now mocked him, exposed him, and condemned him. His career, his illusion of control, had crumbled in an instant. Reynolds turned back to Tyson. You good? He asked, his voice softer now, acknowledging the injustice Tyson had endured. Tyson nodded. Yeah, but this isn't just about me. It's about all the people who deal with guys like him every day. Reynolds sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I know, and you're right. This has to stop. Tyson, with one last glance at the dispersing crowd, turned and resumed his walk, his steps steady, his spirit unshaken. The people clapped him on the back, shook his hand, murmured words of thanks. In their eyes, he wasn't just a boxing legend. He was a man who stood up when it mattered most. As he disappeared into the city's neon-lit horizon, one voice rose above the rest, carrying a message that echoed through the streets. Justice isn't about power. It's about doing what's right. Power should never be a tool for oppression. It must be used to protect, serve, and uplift. This story is a stark reminder that racism and abuse of authority will always lead to downfall, no matter how invincible the oppressor seems. Justice, though sometimes delayed, will always prevail when people stand up against injustice. Strength isn't about brute force. It's about courage, integrity, and standing firm against discrimination. In today's world, we must challenge prejudice, hold those in power accountable, and fight for a society where respect and equality reign. True power lies in doing what's right, not in abusing authority. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from.
If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe Undercover Insights channel.